see what he can do in the midst of unbelievers, on the leading edge with his word, his power, his grace, and his mercy. For God's sakes, we're Lutheran. This is what we know.
Wittenberg. All right, Wittenberg Project. I'd like to thank everybody for joining. Today I have a guest, and something that he put out really struck me when I saw it online. He's the author of a book called, he could go through it a little better than I can, but Ends of the LCMs, I think it's by 2041. And that title just shook me when I first saw it. And I watched his lecture, and Pastor Joe Beran, right?
Beran, yeah, you got it.
I always end up saying Beran because it's so close. You know what I'm saying? But I'm like, nah, no Lutheran is that pious to name himself Beran. You know what I'm saying? I'm pretty sure it's pronounced some other way, you know?
Well, it's so funny you mentioned that, because growing up, there was a church by us that was the Lincoln Berean Church, and we always joked that they misspelled our last name. They threw an E in there, just for fun. But it's Beran. We're missing the E for Berean, but yeah.
They didn't want to give you guys your credit, man. So in regards to your book, I'm hopefully I didn't butcher the title. You want to say?
So the book is called The Ends of the LCMs, and you referenced, so I'll tell a little bit of the story of how I got to the book. So for best practices last year, I did a talk that if your viewers don't know what best practices is, it's a conference in Phoenix, and the way that it works is, honestly, anybody that wants to can submit a proposal to speak. And if enough people say, oh yeah, I want to come and listen to that, then you can come and listen to it. And so I found a bunch of, originally I found some data on the ELCA, and it was a projection into their future. And what was really ugly about the projection into their future was that by 2041, they would go from, like, I want to say having like 800,000 at the time, 600,000 to 800,000, if I remember right, on a Sunday, to like under 100 or under 150,000 on a Sunday. It was just this really downward projection looking into their future. And so I wanted to embark on a journey to say, what could this look like for the LCMS? Is this something we're going to run into?
Right.
And right before it, Lineman Stone, who have nothing but amazing things to say about, he released the Lutheran Religious Life Survey.
So time out. I love that guy.
Yeah.
I saw you mention him on forgot where, but shout out to him. I'm gonna mention him when I release this, because I've been going back and forth like conversations with him for the past probably 8 years.
Yeah.
And like there's been times where things have come up in regards to stuff similar to this, like you know how there's contemporary worship music and there's divine service music.
Yeah.
And then we'll go back and forth on things, and he would come in with his stats and say, well, actually, scientifically, statistically, I love that guy, man. You know what I'm saying? But go ahead. I just wanted to give him his credit, man. Lyman Stone.
Awesome.
But go ahead.
Yeah, Lyman's awesome. And so he put out the LSRS, and so I used some of that data, some other data that it compiled across a bunch of different sources, and gave a talk at best practices. And then wanted to kind of look even more on what this would mean for the LCMS, and kind of put it in a perspective of kind of a narrative perspective to help it be a little more accessible and readable. And so the book is called The Ends of the LCMS because it's kind of a play on the word end, right? So the word end has two meanings. The first meaning everyone thinks of is like everything's coming to an end. It's at its conclusion. It's at its finishing. And I think as you look at the church in America, a lot of times it feels that way. It feels like, oh my goodness, Christianity in America overall, this isn't just the LCMS, just overall seems to be in decline over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And then you feel like it's coming to an end. And so the play on words in the book, though, is focusing on our ends, not as an end as something's coming to an end or a conclusion, but as a telos, as the reason that you exist, right? Like your end goal or your purpose. Can that help us kind of navigate this season? So the book kind of has this intention both to, in the first half, look at some of those statistics I talked about, and then in the second half to say, what would it look like if we started having conversations on what we are or aren't comfortable doing because things are looking like they're going to be a little more challenging in the future?
No, I love the way that you delved into it, where you mentioned diagnosing something before you come up with a treatment. Like actually looking at, okay, your foot hurts. Okay, I can get you some soft shoes, but maybe we should actually look at your foot and see, did you tear a muscle? Is it the way you walk? Are you flat-footed? Like actually getting in there and identifying key issues and problems, and then looking at solutions that address those particular things. Like I've been seeing, it's funny because I ran into your lecture on accident, just sitting at work, getting paid for not working, right? And then right after that, this guy named Pastor Ben Meyer, he was talking to his a kid at his school, at his church, that's going to seminary, you know? So I ran into that, and then I go to Facebook a couple weeks later, and in one of the chat groups, I see people talking about your book. I'm like, okay, like this is after I had emailed you and everything. I'm like, oh
yeah.
I guess I was late to the party. Like I you know, but yeah. So I saw like Dr. Jordan Cooper was talking about it. He's part of AALC.
I don't know if Dr. Jordan Cooper's read it. I'm not that important, man. I'm not anywhere near
but honestly, I saw him talk about it. You know what I'm saying? I saw him mention it in there, and I saw a couple other people engaging the topic, because one of the key things that they were talking about was in one of your stats, you show that I think it's from the age of 18 to 30 or something like that. It was a pretty high number before it dropped off of guys in church. And then Pastor Cooper was saying that's a great stat because we need a lot of males in the church more than we have right now. So that was the context of it. But to see your book used as a reference point, I'm glad people are taking this issue seriously on that level of, you know, scholarly, where, you know, they're not. A lot of times we write to other professors and we use ordo salutis, and we use words that we can use other words that are a lot more easy to digest, but we'll quote the most hardest things to decipher. So for them to actually engage in a book that's directly talking about the ground level stuff, like I'm not trying to please a mental jargon. I'm really talking about ground level stuff in regards to us surviving. That was remarkable for me, seeing that and loving that people are actually engaging it.
Thanks, man. And I'm glad the diagnosis thing kind of resonated. So if, for those of you who don't know, the major metaphor I use throughout the book is my own kind of journey getting diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. And like Lex mentioned, for me, it was like, oh man, my ankle's hurting, all this, you know, is going on. And then eventually getting to a point where, like, you know, you go to one doctor who points you to another doctor who points you to blood work, and then you get this diagnosis. And it's like, oh, okay, so now because I know this, I have options. And I think for us as a church body, it's like, okay, most of the people within the LCMS, most professors, leaders, teachers, district presidents, most parishioners you talk to, they realize like we're not in this, like, you know, 1960s Christian America anymore. We're in an America where there's a little bit more contention around Christianity. You can't assume that people know Bible stories the way that they used to. Right. Even people who say they're Christians, a good majority of them aren't actually plugged into a church or don't have anywhere that they're worshiping. And so it's like the culture has massively shifted. And it's like, okay, well, in light of this, can we start to have conversations on, are there things we're willing to change? Are there things that we're saying, nope, we're not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole? This isn't some like manifesto for us to do radical things. It's just like, hey, we can have a conversation on what do we want to change, what don't we want to change. Like the world is our oyster when it comes to this, because a lot of the things that I think, because a lot of our systems kind of grew up in this very Christian culture. And so as we move into this post-Christian context, we have to kind of say, are we going to still be able to continue to have this sort of a luxury? So
no, I on that topic, one of the things that really struck me was the aspect of how you mentioned like the CMC program in Concordia Irvine.
Yeah.
You know, and like a lot of people don't know that since this is an issue, not Irvine, but Concordia colleges, a lot of them, if you're willing to go there and be there, they'll help. I think they'll cover your tuition or at least take care of a good portion of it. So that actually, like, I was listening to your lecture at first thinking like, man. Well, first I was struck because I'm like, okay, first off, I found Lutheranism on accident. So it's not as if I just found this like about 10 years ago. And I'm trying to share it. And he's telling me it might end. This is not good.
Oh, no.
This is not.
I didn't want to cause
good.
despair.
So I'm like, you know, what's he talking about? You know, But then to hear those resources and options you were mentioning was really touching for me in that regard, because my community knows nothing. Like you say Martin Luther, they think like you forgot to say King. Like there's like you butchered his name. That's his middle name. How dare you?
Yeah.
Like, and it's just crazy in that sense. But on a side note, your lecture, and then I mentioned before, what a pastor friend I know, he I saw his congregant who went to seminary right after yours, and not the topic of this broadcast, but that's something that has been tugging at me, and I've had talks with seminary presidents over the past probably 10 years, I'll say, but something I bring all that up not to make it about me. You mentioned something about being a bivocational pastor, about how there's things like a person who can't go full time, but the need for pastors is so great. Maybe we should look at how we can go about this, because like, for instance, in my scenario, I have kids and God's blessed me with that. And that's my main priority, is to shepherd that. And considering that, I mean, if I'm the only provider in the house, it'll be hard to, not saying because churches don't pay, but I'm just saying it'll be hard to shift career fields in the middle of something like that. Like there's different aspects, and you going into bivocational and other options or other means of going about this was real inspirational and real heavy. Real heavy.
And I wish that I could say that that all of the motivation for the conversation was just like my idea or whatever, but honestly, it's something heavy on my heart a lot, because driven by my context. So just to paint a little bit of a picture, I'm in Southern California, LA area. Cost of living is insanely high. Like if you're I don't think there maybe is like one or two churches in like the LA area that could afford to have a pastor that actually has a house, but like you're rented for the rest of your life if you live here. That's part of the reality. And so what happens in a lot of these churches is they have enough money where maybe they could afford like a Midwest salaried pastor, but the reality is for out here, it's not enough to really cover a pastor to be hired full time. And so like I'm left in this situation, like in my circuit, for example, like even though there's 7-8 churches, really only 4 of them have a full-time called pastor. The others either have a bivocational pastor or they don't have anybody serving them. And of those 4 full-time pastors, only one of those churches can actually afford their pastor off of like tithes and offerings. The other ones, they have to have secondary income, whether it be through renting out property or kind of other ways that they're helping to afford their pastor. And so like it's one of those where it's like this is felt a lot more where cost of living is really high. I know from talking to a few Midwest pastors I know, like there's even in rural Midwest settings, it's kind of similar where if churches are willing to work together, a lot of times they can call a pastor for like 2 or 3 churches, but that comes with all sorts of tricky dynamics as well. But it's like these conversations, the more we can start to begin to say, okay, how do we make sure that our churches are equipped, while at the same time making sure that our pastors are well-rounded and that they are both know their great theological content, but they have the character and the craft of being a good pastor as well too.
Yeah, and that's one thing I did notice from listening to a couple of your lectures is that you mentioned how can I word this? Church plants have a better likelihood of getting new members unchurched, and I won't even just say unchurched. In my personal experience, I think that's also people who might be going to a different church but live close to there. So let me try it out. Even though this other church has been here down the block 55 years, for some reason they're more drawn to the cafeteria church. I just want to see what it's new. I'll be new. Yeah. Hey, And considering the financial part you're talking about, it seems like a kind of like two things conflicting, where it's like we need more pastors, but we can't afford the pastors. But that's kind of the solution in the sense you're saying.
Yeah. So this is a tricky part of the aspect. And this is because I have conversations with a lot of people about the need for pastors. And When I was in convention this summer, I heard an idea that I'd never really heard, that had never come across me before, which is like, well, don't we need a revolving door? Like, don't we need a certain amount of churches that don't have pastors, so that if a pastor gets called somewhere else, there's actually somewhere for him to go, and it's not that like all the churches are locked up all the time, which is fair, but like, and it kind of reflects in an inverted way the idea of unemployment in the U.S. Like, if you talk to economists, they'll say you don't want 0% unemployment because there's no liquidity in the market and it causes all sorts of problems. You actually, like most economists, I think will say somewhere from like 2 to 5% is ideal unemployment rates. If you look at like the rate of how many of our churches do or don't have pastors, which I know is a little bit different, but I do think they reflect each other, we're close to like 9 or 10%. And to what you're saying, the tricky thing is, I don't think we're raising up the same amount of church planners or pastors who will start new churches as we would historically as well. There's been times in the past where we've actually had kind of special offices for these sorts of things.
I was going to mention that. You mentioned we had an office of evangelism.
Yeah, we had the office of the evangelist historically.
That sounds very Pentecostal, I must say, brother. That sounds very Pentecostal. If you start speaking in tongues, man, I'm gonna have to.
No, not that kind of evangelist. And this is something I learned from Mike Newman, the Texas district president, wrote a book, Gospel DNA, where he talks about this within our history. And what's crazy about it within our history is we met in convention and there were people that were concerned because they're saying, wait a second, how do we know these people are like trained enough? How do we know that these people have the right education? How do we know we need to work on like certifying them? And the conclusion we came to at the time is like, if God is using these people and they have pastors or other people working alongside of them, keeping them in check, then why would we try and hamper or throw kind of barriers over what God is doing? And this is a really kind of profound level of trust that pastors are going to be, working with the evangelists, and there'd be this sort of relationship. And yeah, it's an incredible sort of thing. So